So here we have a gradation of oils from the palest to the darkest. And it's the poppy oil, refined walnut oil, a heat-treated walnut oil, meaning that it's the drying process has been started. We'll get into that later. And this is a stand oil, a cold-pressed linseed oil, and this is a boiled walnut oil. So the properties as it goes from the pale to the dark has to do with the contents of the fatty acids. So the pale is slower drying, the darker is faster drying, the pale is more fluid, the darker is more kind of sticky and viscousy, and that largely has to do with the content of the fatty acids and also how far into the drying process it is.
But is it also like basically from lean to fatter?
When you thicken the oil, when it is either exposed to the sun or heat, the oil takes on properties that make it feel more fatty. So even if it's the same amount of oil and it would seem to be the same amount of fattiness, it's the quality of its stickiness and its ability to go over top of another layer, which is the fattiness, increases.
Right, okay. Yeah. So which are the ones that you recommend?
I personally recommend using walnut oil. In my practice, I like that it has a longer open period, which means that there's a longer period in which I can work into the wet layer. With linseed oil, that open period abruptly ends and you can have a skin that makes you then have to kind of step away for a while until that layer dries throughout. Walnut oil has a tendency for the paint layer to dry throughout the layer rather than just on the skin, and that again is a property related to the type of amino acid that is in the oil.
So slower but more solid.
More solid, yeah.
Okay, so you would take away linseed oil, let's put it aside.
Yep.
The boiled, which was a mistake because of the crock pot was not working.
Yeah.
You don't use that.
Yeah.
The stand oil, which is also linseed oil.
Yeah, don't use that.
Yeah. And let's see, now you have
poppy oil and refined walnut oil and heat-treated walnut oil, and sometimes I'll use clove oil.
Right.
And the clove oil is an additive that you only use in a very, very small amount, and that is to extend the open period. Like let's say you wanted to work on a painting that stays wet for a week or 2 weeks. You can use clove oil, which sounds
like a drop
crazy. Yeah, just like a drop in a pile of paint.
Okay.
But that's something for people to experiment with. I also use it to make certain types of pigments that dry very fast, dry a little bit slower, like raw umber. Sometimes I'll add a drop of clove oil.
You get a more democratic palette.
Yes.
Okay, but how? So use refined linseed oil and the heat treated, not literally boiled, but heat treated.
Yeah. So,
in a crock pot, you can make that yourself from that refined linseed oil,
which is here.
Right.
Yeah, from
which
creamer.
Is the creamer that you recommend.
Yeah, because you can get it in, I think this is a liter.
Yep.
Yep, and you can also get a 5 liter, which is, I buy it in a bigger, kind of more bulk.
And you don't want it with cicative in it.
Yeah, because the cicative is a dryer, and so you kind of lose the purpose of the open period entirely.
Right.
I mean, a cicative as an additive for the cooked linseed oil to use in the chalk ground for painting is appropriate because you want that to dry quickly.
And there's no problem with linseed oil in the ground together with chalk and then paint walnut oil. Use walnut oil on top of that.
Exactly.
Right.
But you wouldn't want to do the opposite. You wouldn't want to have walnut oil underneath linseed oil because walnut oil dries slower and the linseed oil dries faster.
Understood.
And that is how you have cracking.
Right. So how you use the crock pot, which one do you recommend, and what's the recipe there?
So this is one that just came with another crock pot I had for cooking like chuck roasts. And this is designed for heating up sauces and fondue at a temperature which seems to be about like 200 degrees Fahrenheit. So it's not heating the oil too much. It's heating it just the amount to kind of start the polymerization process and move it along. And I usually fill this thing up to the top, and then I put the lid on to minimize the exposure to oxygen during the heating process.
And if you want to be sure that things go correct, right? You can take it off during nighttime if you want to be.
Yeah, you
totally
definitely
sure.
want to kind of watch it. I mean, I was pretty anxious about it when I first tried it, but it's very nice because what it allows you to do, it allows you to create a thicker oil, which is more appropriate for the final layers of the painting.
Yeah, if you show how the consistency.
Yeah, so it's like you can watch how the bubble moves. Like this is a bit more like honey, and this is a bit more like water.
Yeah. Right. But how then, when you're using it for the actual medium to keep the actual painting, to stick to the lean to fat or fat over lean, going towards more and more fatness in the medium, how do you practically do that with those two oils? Because then that's just two oils.
That's just two oils, and I'm not using
two
solvent.
gradations.
Yeah. So
not using solvent.
Yeah. So the other thing that comes into play when creating these layers is chalk. Although it's not considered a pigment because it doesn't have any color to it, it's sort of an empty color, is a great additive to paint. I mean, not only just in the ground, but it turns out that it's also wonderful in the early layers and places where you want to build up some texture.
And what type of chalk is that?
This is a chalk from Bologna, which is often...
Kremer.
It's from Kremer, again, and it's used often with gilding. So they take a rabbit skin glue and put this in, and that's a traditional gesso.
Yeah.
And but I also make a medium from this, and some people call it a chalk putty. Oops, no, the back of the spoon. So I just take some and I put it out on a plate, and then and often I keep the oil in things like a sriracha bottle, something that I can squeeze out.
More controlled.
Yeah, more controlled than pouring it. And then for things that I want to use with even more control, I put in these little eyedropper type things. A little bit more. But yeah, you basically want to make this a consistency. I like to compare it to pancake batter.
Mm-hmm.
How do you describe it when you're talking
about? For the ground, you make like a mayonnaise. So it shouldn't run off your palette knife, but it shouldn't stick to it either or cling to it.
Yeah.
I mean, it shouldn't drip off. I mean, of course it runs off to a certain extent, but it shouldn't drip off.
Yeah, I guess I don't eat a lot of mayonnaise or pancake batter, so it's...
Well, but I mean, this is for painting medium, so it's...
Yeah. I mean, that's about right.
Okay.
Yeah. And so that's with just the refined walnut oil. Later layers you could add the cooked walnut oil to have a slightly more viscous-y feeling.
So during the work with the painting, you start with the walnut oil, refined walnut oil with the chalk in it, and then less and less chalk.
Yeah.
And then you can go to just that oil, refined oil, and then sort of start anew with heat-treated walnut oil with chalk in it, and then less and less chalk percentage until you almost only use the oil, correct?
Basically, but the transition period, I guess, between the two is a little bit more mixed. So I might do like the walnut with the chalk, and then let it get more oily, and then switch into this with a little bit of chalk, and then to there's no chalk at all.
Okay, so you wouldn't go to pure refined linseed oil and then switch to this.
Yeah, I wouldn't go to pure refined walnut oil, and then with a chalk layer over it.
Okay.
But I mean, you could. I mean, just you have to pay attention to, you always want to create some tooth, a little sanding in between layers if you can. But if you're working wet in a wet, which I really like to do, you don't have to worry about, creating the tooth. You're just continually painting into the surface.
Right. So how you use this for a wet in wet technique? Because you've been talking about that.
Yeah. So, Odd was doing something called like an imprematura, and he showed me when I was working on this horse painting and taking like a gray color with a little bit of crop block and using a rag and rubbing it over the surface to push things back and then painting into the wet layer. I mean, sometimes I'll oil out things in the later layers, but in the earlier layers, I think it's nice to have some substance into that layer in which you paint. So I often use the walnut and refined walnut with the chalk as the imprematura layer to paint into in the beginning with a palette knife.
So this is like a substitute for linseed oil color. To have a wet layer to work into, you're just using this with the walnut oil and chalk.
Yeah. So, then you have this layer that, is the content is a neutral paint that accepts another color readily. And for me, when I'm starting a painting, I tend just to use colors that have a low tinting strength. Like basically chalk has like 0 tinting strength. But another one that is pretty good for underpainting is, it's okay, I don't know where it went, but is green earth. Green earth has a very low tinting strength. So one economical way of starting a painting is using chalk and then finding like a inexpensive, easy to work with pigment like green earth or raw umber, and making your own paint to like design the structure of the painting and work out some of the light and darks before you jump into, the expensive oil colors that come from a tube.
Right.
So I just, sprinkled a little bit of the pigment onto the palette, and then I added some of the chalk into it. And it, makes a nice little paste. And if you wanted to make like a lighter version of that, you could just add a little bit more chalk and a lighter version again.
Right, you can just gradate it.
Yeah, and gradate it a little bit. And just, it's the drag is different than dry brushing. I have a little bit more chalk in that, but it's a light undertone.
Yeah, and you can just make that darker if you need.
You can make that darker with more pigment.
Yeah. So you get sort of a ghost image.
Yeah. So you can also make a darker version by just adding the walnut oil directly to it. And then the thing is, when you're mixing paint that you're going to use the same day, it's totally appropriate to just use a palette knife. If you were to make a paint that you were going to store into a tube, you would need to mix it a little bit thoroughly, like with a glass muller. And then you'd also need to use a gelling agent that would prevent the pigment from coming out of solution. So, eventually the pigment will want to kind of like settle down through gravity. It'll kind of fall through the oil, and then the oil will come up on top. This aluminum stearate, which is a recent additive to paint you find in almost every single tube of paint that you buy at the store. It makes the oil thicker and more jelly-like.
This is also a Kremer product.
Yeah, this was a Kremer product. I sometimes use it when I'm making paint. Like, let's say I was wanting to use this green earth and I found it a little bit too runny and drippy. I could add a tiny bit, like very small, like, sticking the end of like the handle of a spoon in there.
Right.
And it would make it so that it just would stick more to the knife. Some people are concerned about it because it can yellow, but I think you just use it very sparingly.
Yeah.
And you don't have to worry about that. So yeah, I mean,
so there's no problem with modeling.
Yeah. So
even though you get more sort of a glass painting effect of it.
Yeah, speaking of glass painting, it's like the chalk has a transparency.
Yeah, look at that. Yeah.
That's built in, and yeah, so you can
really keep loose. I mean,
it's like charcoal drawing almost.
Nice.
Yeah,
that has a nice effect. Okay, is there anything else, or should we finish off with like a short overview, the main bullet points? What's the point of it?
Yeah, I think the point of it is if you experience any sort of health issue with, I don't know, skin irritation from the traditional linseed oil solvent mixture, which is the most typical medium, then walnut oil might be a smart alternative. If you find that you want your paint to stay wet longer, so you can work and adjust it and kind of blend a bit more, walnut oil might be a good alternative for you. It's just something that is kind of it sort of fell off radar in history, and I think a lot of historical painting techniques are kind of coming back to light in our time after disappearing for quite a while. So I just wanted to share this as an alternative, for health, and also just
for actual benefits of the technique.
Yeah, and it's just like extending the vocabulary of your mediums.
Thank you for checking out this video from the School of Apelles. To watch the full video and access our premium library, go to caveofapelles.com/subscribe and become a $10 patron. That's caveofapelles.com/subscribe.